Welcome to our podcast for college Catholics, where we discuss faith and spirituality from a Catholic perspective. I'm Father Patrick, and today we will welcome Deacon Benjamin. How are you doing, Deacon?
Doing great, Father Patrick. Thank you for welcoming me back.
Yes, and we will be talking about the 7 capital sins, or also called sometimes deadly sins.
Mm-hmm.
And we read in the Catechism that when we commit sin, that is an action against the law of God, not only do we do something that is wrong, and we offend God and our neighbor, but we also promote sin, both in others and in ourselves. So then sin engenders a tendency to sin. And then that tendency to sin is called vice. And then sin creates and sometimes creates a vice or strengthens a vice in us. And those vices in turn incline us to sin. So there's a vicious cycle there. Vicious circle. So sin also clouds our intelligence and slowly corrupts our will. So there's a classification of sins according to the fact that they are the main vices, or they are vices under which we could group other sins or most sins. And that's why Saint Gregory the Great, in one of his works on his morals, or in Latin moralia, calls them capital, and which capital comes from, just like the city of a state, right? Capital comes from the Latin caput, capitis, which means the head or something that is at the head of a group.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, many other sins or vices can be classified under these 7 capital sins. And in English, they call them sometimes deadly, or in the US, they call them deadly. And this is can lead to think that these 7 deadly sins are always mortal sin. And that is not the case, right? So that's why it would be more proper to call them capital sins than deadly sins.
That's a good distinction.
Right. So in the Catechism, we read the following in Numbers 1865 and 1866. We read, "Sin creates a proclivity to sin. It engenders vice by repetition of the same acts. This results in a perverse inclination in us, which clouds our conscience and corrupts the concrete judgment of good and evil. Thus, sin tends to reproduce itself and reinforce itself, but it cannot destroy the moral sense at its root. So vices can be classified according to the virtues they oppose, or also be linked to the capital sins, which Christian experience has distinguished, following St. John Cassian and St. Gregory the Great. They're called capital because they engender other sins, other vices, and they are pride, avarice, envy, wrath, lust, gluttony, and sloth, or acedia." So, Deacon Benjamin, you can start with, lead us with pride.
Oh, man. Okay. That's a dangerous one, isn't it?
Right, actually, and just before you start, I said lead us with pride, right? Sometimes pride can be the wrong sense of the word, or pride can be the good sense of the word,
sure,
right? So we would say pride in this sense as a sin, or arrogance, or vainglory, right? And more or less the same thing. Mm-hmm. The pride of saying, okay, I have pride in being a Catholic, or pride in being a Michigander,
right,
or I'm proud of being an American, means I'm happy to have the honor to be something, right? So in that sense, pride can be confusing a little bit. We talk about here the sin or the vice of pride.
Of course. And we'll give it the pride of place. That's another phrase they use. We'll make it first. Pride, it's interesting because it's also the queen, so to speak, the king, if you want, the head of all sin in a way. So when we talk about it, there's always the tendency to maybe confuse that aspect. All sin comes from pride. So it's always good to have that in mind. So we just have to fight that disordered thought of ourself or love of ourself that puts us over God.
And it can also be called root of all sin or vice, because pride makes us rebel against God.
Sure.
Right? We always break a commandment of God, right? By
the sin par excellence of Lucifer, right, of the devil. Right? He was pride, thought that he could rebel against God. So the definition, the classic definition, is this inordinate or disordered esteem for one's own excellence. So it's that idea of thinking more of myself than I should. So of course, as you were mentioning in the beginning, there's of course an ordered, good love of self that should always be seen in the light of God. But what we're talking about here is obviously that disordered. When I put myself in the center, I put myself eventually even above, in the perfection of this sin, in its completion, you'll be putting myself higher than even God, or more central than God. So that's that disordered love of self. Just a side note, because if anyone here likes to do their own research or reading, and they start looking it up, what they'll see is underneath pride, there's also one of these manifestations, which is vainglory.
Right.
And St. Thomas makes that distinction as well. Basically, it's just to keep pride in the hierarchy as the number one, so to speak. And so he puts that emphasis on it, but vainglory, pride, sometimes you see those interchangeable.
Right. In a sense, pride is that desire to be more than others, or to think oneself more than others, even sometimes more than God. That's why sometimes we think we are the ones who decide good and evil, right? So sometimes legislators think they're in the place of God, right? Or even judges can be in the thinking that they're in the place of God, and that can be dangerous. But then vainglory is the desire to be praised, right? And that's why it's like one of the sins under the capital vice of pride.
It's interesting though, we're just getting started, but kind of the overarching, that disorder, that aspect that we see so often in sin.
Right.
Because in their proper order, all these things that we're going to touch on are good, right? We're supposed to love ourselves.
Right.
It's good to be recognized. It's good to love your nation, right? Patriotism, nationalism, in a good sense. So it's always a perversion of something that should be good. So I think that's something I just wanted to point that out. Putting myself in the center, obviously. I should be loved as a child of God, as God loves me, and that's why I love myself. When I turn that around and make my love of myself my own excellence, well, they were walking a bad line, so to speak.
Right, and also to love oneself in God, right, as God loves me, not to love myself for myself merely.
There's actually it's always good to go to the saints, right? So St. John Vianney, he says that pride makes us hate our equals because they are our equals. Right? There's that it pits us against everyone else because I have to be number one. I have to be the best, which eventually, of course, pits us against God, as we see in the devil. Every act of sin is pitting us against, opposing God. And it's so clearly seen in St. John Vianney. He points that out, that it makes us to hate others.
Right, and then what are some of the sins connected with it? We said vainglory, then we have presumption, right? Presumption, like a sin under pride, the one that makes us attempt what we know to be beyond our powers, right?
Sure.
We think so much about ourselves, and without the proper order, that we think we can do things that we shouldn't be doing, that we might fail at doing, or that it's not our place to do, right?
Right.
And then you also have ambition, right? That is the unreasonable inclination to obtain certain honors and dignities that are beyond our position, or to desire them too eagerly when they are proper to us through sinful means. For example, when one wants to be, I would like to be a governor, or I'd like to be a bishop, or I'd like to be the Pope, or whatever. So sometimes there's an ambition there that is excessive because it may not be for me to do that, or maybe it is for me, but I'm looking for it in excessive ways or sinful ways.
Yeah, that's also, you see there how clearly it clouds our vision, right? Because you think you're something that you're not, and you set yourself up to look like a fool in a certain sense oftentimes, right? It's kind of like what our Lord says. Don't go to the top of the table. Sit at the end of the table and let someone invite you up if that's your place. So yeah, you see there very clearly that's what pride does. And it makes us think about ourselves, and we lose sight of everything, really, because it loses its order. Right. A good point.
So do you have any example to give in the...
Of pride?
Of pride.
Well, like I said, I think the typical one is just, you think of Lucifer in his desire to put himself before God. Then, of course, there's Adam and Eve also. Clearly, God had said this is the way things should be. And when Eve, listening to Lucifer, she's putting her own intellect, her own reasoning, her own judgment above what God had clearly said was what he desired. So I feel like those two are probably the epitome examples, right? But then you can take any daily example even. Think about when those of you who are still at home with your parents, maybe. Your parents who have all the experience of their lifetime, so it is a supernatural example, and they give you some advice, and the first thing you do is...
So it's a super natural example. From the natural order, but it's a super example of a natural order.
An extremely natural example that all of us live through. But what happens when they give us that advice? 8 times out of 10, 9 times out of 10, maybe you're more virtuous than I was in my younger days. So maybe let's say 6 times out of 10. But there's always that first instinct, when we're still being moved by our passions and our pride, to say, who are they to tell me what to do? Or who are they to give me advice? So I think that's a very typical impulse that's sponsored by, motivated by pride.
Right.
It's that thing that I know better. I put myself above them. When it's clear that they have more experience, they have more knowledge. So I think it's a pretty basic day-to-day example.
And then two examples here that I thought about that typically happen in college. One is when you're in class and the teacher asks for, some input, and one is always so eager to respond before others when maybe others have the answer, right? Also.
True.
So we want to say it to show that we know more than the others, just for that reason. Or when we're in a social environment and we want to be the center of attention, right? So to make jokes and make funny and be cool and to be the center of attention. Okay, very good. Well, so then we have the sin of, or the capital vice of avarice, also called covetousness, which is the inordinate love for temporal things like possessions, or usually wealth and riches and money, in a word. So wealth in itself, it's a good thing that can be desired as a way to provide for one's sustenance and the sustenance of one's family, and for the good of others, also to help others, and even, as we should, to help the church, right, to support the church.
Sure.
However, one can desire that wealth in an inordinate way. That is, either too intensely, suppose the amount is a reasonable amount, but I desire it too intensely, or putting too much passion in obtaining it, to the point of disregarding other obligations to one's neighbor, or desiring also more wealth that I really need, and this can lead to other sins like stealing or committing fraud, etc. In that sense, St. Thomas Aquinas says that, in St. Paul says in Timothy, in the first letter of St. Timothy 6:10, that this vice of avarice is the source of all evils, as it can become very deeply rooted and overpowering. This love of riches can be overpowering.
Oh.
So this vice, in a sense, is to a certain sense insatiable, because it seems to be, experience shows that the more we have, the more we tend to think we need. Right? So I think there was a Forbes magazine, one of those magazines, that they interviewed the 10 richest people in America, and they asked them how much more money they needed to feel content.
Right.
And everybody was thinking of about 25 to 50% more wealth than that they had. You know? Something like that. I read it a while ago, and it always struck me like, okay, they already have so much, but they still think they need this amount more.
Never enough.
Right. And it happens to all of us, right?
Sure.
And it leads to other vices like hardness of heart toward those in need, and not giving alms, or sometimes harshly exacting payments of debts when maybe it's not possible to the other person, like the parable of the dishonest servant in Matthew chapter 18, verse 28. Or it leads to anxiety regarding the possible loss of wealth and the deceit in handling wealth, or lying to have financial gain, or committing fraud. So in this sense, for example, sometimes we could we could crave, right, to have more money than we really need. And that can lead, sometimes even in young couples that are married or recently married or about to get married, to work so hard that they forget that they're working for their own marriage and their own family, right? So they work so hard that finally they don't communicate with each other, and they are like they're singles living on their own, working for each other, and sometimes getting together to speak or whatever.
Right. They lose sight of the reason they're working so hard.
Right.
It's interesting about this, though. Father, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not just riches, right? It's the idea of like having, like I have to possess.
Right.
And I think that's also something that sometimes we overlook is, we just think avarice, greed, okay, wealth, money. Oh, I don't have any money, no problem for me. But it also can relate to anything, right? I get desire to, I don't know, my time. I can be super greedy with my time, or I could be with people, my car, that over desire of possession, right? Just that this is mine, I have to protect it, I have to have it, I have to have more. think that's a really good point as well. Even thinking about, I had a friend who seemed like he knew everybody. He was the guy that knew everybody. But in reality, looking back on it, and I don't want to judge his soul, I don't know exactly what he had in his heart, but it seemed like he was kind of collecting people in a sense.
Right.
Building up his likes, building up his friends.
Networking.
Absolutely. But not even in the sense of trying to get somewhere. It was just like he had to have that sense of comfort of possessing, quote unquote, people. And I feel like that might fit well here as well. The kind of a greed of needing to possess.
Right. Like in the one of the works of C.S. Lewis, where there's a woman, a character that is so attached to her son that doesn't want to let go even through death or anywhere. She wants to carry him even to purgatory or hell to be with him. Right.
The Great Divorce.
Right. The Great Divorce. There you go.
The great scene. Powerful.
Yeah. So the remedy, one remedy of this against this sin or vice could be to remember how fleeting this world is, right? How it's passing by. And as one Bishop Brom in San Diego, who received us in San Diego, he once said in a talk he was giving to teachers that talking about death and the attachment to wealth, that he never saw a casket with a U-Haul attached to it. Right, so
that's a good image.
The U-Haul stays in this world. The person in the casket goes to the next.
That's a good image.
So you have to leave everything, as Saint Teresa says. We have to leave everything, whether you like it or not, sooner or later.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why the opposing virtue to avarice is spiritual poverty and liberality in giving to others. By the way, an anecdote: the word avarice, if I'm not mistaken, comes from one of the barbarian tribes or kingdoms, the kingdom of the Avars.
Okay.
Who, to keep their possessions safeguarded from everyone, they would go and the booty they would bring together and pile it up.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So they would pile it and pile it and pile it and pile it up, and they would not let anyone touch it. Right. So from there comes avarice.
Neat.
The piling up of things that can be, in itself, it's not always mortal, but it can get to a mortal sin, right? And this can happen in maybe in college, right? With your things, you don't want to lend them to anyone because you're so protective of your pen, your computer, your bicycle, your
silly things.
Food.
Yeah,
anything can be. Yeah. So what's the next sin that you have? The sin of envy there.
The sin of envy. And this gets us into a distinction here. Envy is different. Okay, envy, unlike the other deadly sins or capital sins, vices, whatever distinction you want to use, here we're not going to look at a disordered good, but it's a sadness, and that's really unique about envy. Also, we'll see it as well with sloth or acedia, and it's a sadness because of the goods that another has, which are regarded as what? As in some way harmful to me, since they diminish my own excellence or renown. That's the definition. What is he saying there? That I become sad, I become upset, I become angry because someone has something.
Right.
And I think that's somehow going to take away from me, not necessarily because I want it. So there's the distinction between jealousy, right? There's not this sadness at the prospect that I'm going to lose something necessarily, but I'm sad because the other has. I'm sad or upset or angry because the other is excellent or did well or is successful. And so there you see it's really an ugly, even vicious sin in that aspect.
And it harms us. It corrupts us entirely.
Yep. I'm reacting to someone else's good.
Right.
And of course, that deforms my own soul. Instead of taking joy in my brother and my friend and that person who has succeeded, who has done well, who has, in whatever way, shined in the light, and they're in the limelight, so to speak. Instead of taking joy in that, congratulating them, there's that little guy inside of me that says, oh man, I can't wait to see them fall on the ground. I can't wait to see them break their leg. I can't wait to see how they fail. So this is a terrible, terrible disposition of soul, if you want, and it's marked by this sadness. It's really an ugly thing, like I said, a vicious sin.
Right, and also it can be envy for human, natural, material things, intellectual things, But the worst envy would be the envy for spiritual things.
Sure.
Right? When one is upset because the other one prays more.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And this happens a lot in good people, right? In good spiritual people. We are envious because the other one seems to be more virtuous, seems to be holier, holier. And in reality, we must remember, as a cure to that, we should always remember that all those gifts, human talents, right, and even spiritual talents, are a gift of God. So the one we have to praise for these things is God, and not the person who has them, because we might have also talents and goods, but they're not ours to get prideful about, but to praise God for, right? So
that's a good point.
So we got to be especially careful with spiritual pride.
Good point. When we're just getting started, or we're getting really excited about, we had as they say now, reversion. You hear that phrase a lot, or a second conversion,
right?
And we're all on fire, but then we might get frustrated. There's a moment of difficulty, and that's a perfect moment when the devil might slip in, and you see someone else in the pew next to you who just seems to be in this perfect state of prayer,
right?
And you got to just be careful there. Give praise to God. God, thank you for this good example, right?
Right.
Or thank you because you're glorified in this person's good prayer, or whatever the case might be. That's a really good point, to make the distinction between the physical, natural goods and the supernatural, spiritual goods.
Right.
I think it's another, at the beginning, we talked about pride. And of course, you go back to the first sin, the biggest sinner, so to speak, in our minds is always the devil, Lucifer, that
right,
the prince, the king of sin. And there's also envy with Lucifer, envy with the devil, right? And he sees Adam and Eve, and also us nowadays, it's not just once. And there's a sadness because we have this happiness, right? Because we have what he threw away.
Right.
He knows he's never going to get it. So in that sense, it's not that jealousy in that particular aspect, but it's sadness at that good, that supernatural good, which we possess as friends of God. So you see that again in the devil. You see that in perfectly in how the devil hates us. How he hated Adam and Eve.
Very good. And then in college or for young adults, sometimes can be a good example, especially grades, right? Grades or intellectual ability, right? Because we're in school, or even popularity. We're upset at the fact that the other one is more popular, or more sociable, or liked, or has more likes in Instagram or whatever platform you use.
Yep.
So for those things, we have to be careful.
Yeah, or typical, the one that Pope always talks about, rumors and kind of talking badly about people behind their backs.
Right.
That's a temptation all the time, and it's a perfect manifestation of this as well. We see someone else growing in popularity, as you said, or successful, and so I can't reach them, I can't get to them, but I can undercut them, I can talk badly about them.
Right.
And again, at the root of that, there might be envy.
Right. And then a good cure to that, I think, would be to remember that it's more important what God thinks of me than what human beings think of me, right? Because many times the envy is because of a human natural perspective or human naturalistic point of view. But if you look at things from a spiritual point of view, there's nothing to be envious about, because whatever good we have is for God and given by God. So we have to be content with what we have and do our best within what we have and achieve the goals that God wants us to achieve. Right. And that may be much less in one case than in another. Very good. Then we have the capital vice of wrath or anger, which is the inordinate desire to take revenge. And it can be inordinate in regard to the object that causes the anger, or the degree in which that anger is vented or expressed. For example, in the sense that, the object might be, a person dropped a pen on the floor, and then I'm really upset and I throw the pen through the window,
Yeah.
And that can happen. Sometimes you get so upset for some little thing. So the object of the anger, it doesn't make sense. And this happens with parents sometimes when they get overly upset with a child that is a baby because he's crying, right? And how can the baby know he shouldn't cry? He's not able to figure. So the anger for those things is inappropriate, right? And sometimes it can be also inappropriate because of or wrong because of the degree of the retaliation, right?
Okay, yeah.
So the baby did something wrong and then I spank him, right? When in reality, it's excessive. Or with a friend, for example, this friend didn't lend me his book, I will never, ever talk again to him. Like, okay, so it's an excessive response. So, yeah, go ahead.
I'm just thinking the varying degrees of anger, right? Because you say wrath, at least most of us, at least myself, think wrath, you think, oh, I'm not wrathful, because that's like, you think of, I don't know, a war chief or something.
Right, or something with the eyes of the devil yelling at you.
Exactly, red eyes and the horns. But it can take any kind of form, right? It's just again, it could be that, that kind of sigh when someone says something.
Right.
But that could be a manifestation of anger as well.
Yes.
In a more moderate sense, but we're trying to look at the roots here, and that's good to have in mind.
And in different personalities, it's expressed in different people in different ways, right? In for example, men tend to go into a fist fight. Girls maybe go to gossip or just a cold shoulder or a silent treatment.
That's true.
And that's a different way of wrath or anger. It seems to be less harmful if it's a silent treatment, but it can be terrible as well, especially in a marriage, right? When one of them doesn't want to speak to the other until, I don't know, something has changed. So it can be an expression of anger. So depending on its degree, it can be mortal sin because it usually goes against charity and justice, and it may lead to damage other people seriously in their person, their image, or even in their property. Now, if this, as well, we can spiritualize it, it can sometimes be directed toward God. And that can be very serious because it can lead to blasphemy, right, to insult God, or even to the loss of one's faith, which is both very serious. So it can lead to several other vices. The unreasonable indignation for small reasons, unreasonable indignation, preoccupation of mind to think ways of taking revenge. I remember it's a long novel, the Count of Monte Cristo.
Oh yeah, great one.
Right. If you read the novel, it's so intricate on how he's doing all this to take revenge, right?
Brilliant. But it's brilliant.
yeah, it's incredible. But the preoccupation of mind to think ways of taking revenge, right? Sometimes one can spend hours on thinking, right?
I should have done it this way, or I would have done this to him.
Right.
Imagine you put that same effort into doing something good.
Right. Another sin that it can lead to is excessive attacks against others. And finally, what we also already mentioned, blasphemy, quarreling, cursing, physically harming others, and even sometimes killing intentionally or by accident, right? And that's very dangerous. And of course, some of these are mortal sins. So the virtue to practice against this anger is the virtue of meekness. And we can pray to Jesus, who is meek and humble of heart. Particularly, we can pray the litany of humility or litany of the Sacred Heart, right? To teach us to be meek and humble of heart.
Absolutely.
Why don't you talk about the next one?
Okay. The next one on the list is lust. The capital vice or sin of lust is our disordered desire for sexual pleasure. And unfortunately, in the culture we live in, it's seen almost as a virtue. You know what I mean? It's it's everywhere. So this is a very prevalent vice because it's a second nature, it's a disposition of the culture we live in. And the thing about lust is it's not just physical, right? It tends to corrupt also our mind,
right.
Our intellect, our will. Everything kind of is debased, brought down, corrupted by this disordered desire for sexual, carnal pleasures. We stop saying things clearly. We might make decisions extremely hasty because we don't take the time. We'll lose patience. All these things that don't seem to have any relation. Experience shows that all of these things are involved, right? The person's a whole. So we can't fall in one area without somehow having an effect in my other aspects of my life. Even the aspect of, again, very difficult with a lot of people nowadays, keeping commitments. Somehow, the falling into the vice of lust can even make it harder for me to keep a commitment. It makes me less patient, less likely to persevere, less diligent. So it's, based in myself, a growing love of myself and in this world. And I begin to lose sight more and more and more of my last end, of my true end. So essentially love, which is supposed to be always geared towards the other, gets inverted, distorted towards me. And that's the terrible aspect of lust when it's continually carried out. It just deforms that person and makes them totally turned in on themselves. That actually makes me think also of Our Lady of Fatima. So the apparitions to the little shepherds, right? And what did San Jacinta, Jacinta. She says that Our Lady says that the sins which cause most souls to go to hell are the sins of the flesh.
Wow.
And that's powerful. That should be something that makes us reflect. And that's why I think it's at least for myself, and I imagine there's many others out there that have the same thing, to realize that it's that debasing of our vision. We're supposed to be looking up towards God, looking up towards that supernatural end. And when we get caught into the carnal pleasures, and this, could even lead to food, to drink, to comfort, all these things can kind of fall under this capital sin, capital vice, and they pervert that desire for the supernatural end.
Right. Now, one clarification is that the sexual desire in itself is created by God, and it's good. It's a good instinct that humanity has for the reproduction and preservation of the human race.
Absolutely.
Right? Just as in the animals and the human beings as well. But it has to be ordered, right? So it is ordered as long as it is ordered toward the procreation of one's own children, and the union of the spouses.
Right.
So that is properly used, this sexual desire, within marriage, right? And when within marriage or without marriage, when a person desires the sexual pleasure without any intention of bringing about children, absolutely not. And that can lead to the objectifying of the other person, and for selfish reasons. And that's where it becomes lust, right? When it's completely enclosed in oneself, and it is the deformation of love, right? So
thank you. That was a good clarification as well. But it's really tied to a lot. I was thinking as I was speaking about the food and the comforts, to gluttony, which is, we'll talk about that here shortly. But I just see that very clearly, right? Because they're both, as you were saying, the ordered things that we get pleasure in,
right,
when they're ordered correctly,
given by God.
God is happy about that. Right. But it becomes disordered in these vices we're looking at now.
Right. And any other sins or vices that are underneath lust? I know one, it's not a vice necessarily, but it's a consequence of lust, is the clouding of our mind regarding faith. So when one is given into lustful things, pornography, impure things, etc., one tends to have a much harder time to understand the truths of faith. It's indirectly proportionate to the faith and the lust, right? So the more lust we have practice or fall into, the less possible it will be to have a strong faith.
I'm sure. But it makes sense, of course, right? I mean, you're filling up your heart, you're filling up your mind with something totally carnal, sensual, in a bad way.
Right.
So it's harder for me to see what I can't see with my own eyes. It's hard for me to care about those things. So, and the clouding of the mind, for instance, all of us know that prayer is the lifeline, the fuel of our spiritual life. We have to talk with God. And it's going to be harder and harder to pray the more I'm putting my heart into that material carnal aspect of gratification. So there's that's an important tie there.
We're gonna,
and of course the virtue that we have to practice, temperance, right?
Temperance and modesty also helps. Temperance and modesty helps also because it's like chastity, of course, but modesty helps in the sense of it's like a protection. Some call it like a bulwark for chastity, right? So modesty in the eyes, guarding of the eyes, modesty in our conversation, modesty in the way people dance and the way people dress, and so forth, and the things we look at. We cannot just look at everything and hope to just be chaste.
Sure, absolutely.
Very good. Well, then we have the capital vice of gluttony, which is the inordinate indulgence in food or drink, and maybe other similar substances. And it is sinful because our right reason and order demands that food and drink be taken for the nourishment that is proper to our human nature, but not merely for pleasure and, in a sense, excluding all other rational ends, right? So gluttony, again, it's a disorderly practice of something that is otherwise good. So it's good to feel hunger and desire to feel pleasure when I eat food or I drink some fresh water and it's a hot day. But it can lead to that inordinate desire of the pleasure. So there is gluttony when food or drink are used in such quantity or the quality or with such avidity, desire, as to exceed rational or reasonable requirements, right? Or taking it in excess for pure pleasure, right? And to the point of harming our health of body or the proper disposition of the mind. So, of course, one can eat or drink something to enjoy a moment with friends, even when I'm not completely hungry and not necessarily hungry, but I eat something to share, right? Or have a drink to share a good moment with friends or with family or to celebrate. Or even if I'm like a little down and I have a chocolate, to get some emotional boost from a simple pleasure, as long as it's not in excess or it doesn't damage one's health or impair one's ability to think rationally, right? So in that sense, gluttony can become a serious sin. Typically it's not, right? Because one can eat a little bit in excess and say, okay, that was gluttony, but it wasn't a mortal sin.
Fair.
But it can become a serious sin, for example, when one gets completely intoxicated, right, and doesn't remember what was going on, or when one eats foods that can seriously damage one's health. I'm thinking like, for example, a case of a diabetic who eats a lot of ice cream and a cake and then some Gatorade,
Right, totally over the top.
Right. So the virtue contrary to gluttony is temperance, which moderates the desire, that rational desire for food and drink.
No, Father, so you mentioned there that it's not just quantity. So also quality, you were saying?
Right. Because in some cases, some people desire a certain refinement of food that is excessive.
Okay.
Right. That it takes a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of people to prepare, and when maybe there's absolutely no need whatsoever of such refinement.
Okay.
Right. A great example of gluttony, not in this case of refinement, but probably yes, sometimes was the Romans, right, which would eat and eat and eat, and then have some ice cream or lemon ice cream to eat more and cleanse the palate, palace cleanser, and then eat more and more and more, and then throw up to be able to eat more and more and more, right? Wow. So those are an evident example of gluttony.
Sure.
Right?
Very clear. Actually, there's also many of you will probably be watchers or readers of the Hunger Games. And in the Hunger Games, that same scenario is played out with the rich I forgot the name of the main city, but in the principal city.
Yes,
all of the rich and all of these vices we're talking about pretty much are manifested in this book very clearly, which is actually interesting. That would be an interesting conversation as well. But that particularly, they do that just as the Romans did. They would eat, and then they would pass around buckets, or there's a certain place they would go to vomit and be able to continue eating.
My goodness.
So it's a very, as you said, very clear, over-the-top example.
Right. So, all right. Well, let's go to sloth.
Okay, sloth. Sloth, or acedia, again, this is going to fall into the other category, as I mentioned, like envy, which is a kind of sadness. So it's going to be a little different from the other 5. And it's a sadness or sorrow in the face of spiritual good, in as much as it is God's good. So it's not just lazy. That's why we throw in the sloth or acedia to make that distinction, to point out that it's not just laziness. It's not just being, sitting around on a Saturday morning because I don't feel like doing anything. That could be a symptom of acedia. It could be a symptom of this vice we're speaking about. But this vice, this sin, is directed towards my spiritual good. And so it's obviously more dangerous than just sleeping in, or, I don't know, maybe I went for a jog and instead of 2 miles, I just ran 1.5, right? That's kind of a laziness. So it's connected. Exactly. Laziness connected. It's also wrong. But here we're talking about the spiritual sadness, a spiritual vice of being, quote unquote, lazy in the spiritual things. Now, it's a sadness also, and this is obviously very unfortunate when you say it, but it happens, right? In our desire for holiness. Mm. So as I no longer see holiness, I no longer see sanctity as something that I desire.
Right, as something worthwhile seeking.
Worth my effort, right? Worth putting myself towards and expanding my energy and my efforts to achieve. And that's acedia. That's the sloth we're talking about here. Fulton Sheen actually has a very good book. It's called Victory Over Vice. And he says that sloth is a malady, so a sickness of the will, which causes us to neglect our duties in regards to the spiritual good. Now, it can be physical or spiritual. So he says very clearly that the physical can oftentimes be a symptom of the spiritual, in the sense that I've lost sight of my end, my ultimate end, my higher end, my spiritual end. And so therefore, I'm not motivated in life, period. It is spiritual when it shows itself as a continuing Fulton Sheen. It is spiritual, so that sloth, that laziness, when it shows itself in an indifference to character betterment. I no longer care if I'm growing or not, if I'm getting better or not. A distaste for the spiritual, a hurried crowding of devotions, a lukewarmness and failure to cultivate new virtue. So it's that loss of interest in my sanctity. It's very simply put. But it's very dangerous, and that's why they would even call it the saidia. The medievals in the monastic tradition often calls it the noonday devil.
Right.
Because I get into a routine, I get into the habit, and I'm going through these things, but my heart's not in them. There's no desire to grow in holiness. I think, at least for me, what's really helpful for me is reading the lives of saints and listening to the lives of saints. And that's oftentimes all it takes. Of course, there's great examples, great stories, oftentimes better than most of the movies that are out today.
Right.
But also it renews us in that desire for holiness, because we get excited about the great things they did. We get excited about God's grace, God's work in their lives, and it keeps motivating us to look for that in our own lives. So I think I would say that's a hands down a go-to remedy, a defense, and just something to keep in our plan of life of every day, our daily routines. Try to continue to be in the habit of learning about the saints' lives, reading about the saints' lives.
Right, and one thing that is connected to acedia is sometimes to be overly committed to work, right? To work so much, even good things. So this can happen to a priest, can happen to a religious, can happen to a lay minister, to a young youth minister, to a young adult coordinator, that we have so much work to do that we don't have time to pray. And when we get a chance to pray, it's so difficult to concentrate because we're thinking about 100,000 other items that we cannot center on God. And that is a type of acedia, right? So to avoid praying, because I don't like to pray now because I have so many other things to do, right? So that's a thing to be careful with.
And of course, St. Ignatius teaches us, right? We try to find God in all things. So I think sometimes it's like you were talking about, or Father, you talked about when we have... was it envy? I believe it was. When we see others that are growing in holiness.
Right, correct. Envy.
Okay, so in a similar vein, I think we get so active, and a lot of you out there are so active. Maybe you're doing youth ministry, as Father mentioned. Maybe you're missionaries, or whatever the case might be. So you're doing good things, but we have to remember to find God in those things and to do those things in a sort of prayer,
right?
So that they don't, as you're pointing out, become obstacles to our heart searching God, our prayer life, and etc.
Right, and a good thing to have in mind in that area is that we have to carve out some time for prayer, some time for the rosary, some time for examination of conscience, and then to have an annual spiritual exercises retreat, right? We in Miles Christi, we preach, and always in the podcast notes, episode notes, I always put a link to our spiritual exercises webpage, so anyone can always look what retreats are coming up, and that is very important to avoid acedia. Right?
Yeah.
So good. Yeah. Any other comments about all this, or any other examples that you can think of?
That just came to my mind right now, and I'll share it because I think it's really good. I don't know if it's his, but so I had a friend of mine. I met him actually when I was in Rome. So I was studying at the Jellicum, and a friend of mine, he's married, he has kids, he's a layman, a lay faithful. And we were talking about this, how a lot of times people say, oh, I pray to God always, because they don't have any time of meditation, or they don't have any moment carved out for God in their day. Oh, but I pray always. And he said, his line was, in order to talk to God all the time, I have to have some moment, some time where I only talk to God.
Right.
So saying you talk to God all the time. If that's true, there has to be some moment where I'm just talking to Him. Otherwise, something's going to lose out there. You're either going to be disordered. You're not really searching for Him. You're just talking to yourself. There has to be some moment of, just like a marriage relationship, or a husband and a wife, or a boyfriend and a girlfriend. There has to be that intimate, private time of conversation with God, so that then we can find Him in all things.
Right. Some of that quality time.
Quality time, exactly.
Which it would be like a time of meditation or a retreat or something.
Yeah, right.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Deacon Benjamin, for all your
pleasure.
insights.
Hope
It was
I
great to
could help
have
a
you.
little bit.
Yes. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today and for bearing with us and our treatise on the seven capital vices. Please share this episode with your friends, and maybe you can help others be more fervent in their spiritual life.
Absolutely.
And please also, if you can, leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you all.
We'll see you next time, and may God bless your day.